So before we know it, we are on the third of our Luminaries in Rowan Williams's book, The 20 Lives of People Who Show Something of the Christian Way. And number 3 is St. Augustine of Hippo. I must admit that he is a theologian that has a special place in my heart. When I did my theology degree, we all had to pick a special theologian, somebody in particular that we would study in more detail. And I don't know why I picked St. Augustine, but I did. I think because a friend of mine who he's a priest but does academic scholarship, did St. Augustine and said, if you want to understand Western Christian thought, you have to understand St. Augustine. And so I took on the challenge. St. Augustine lived from the middle of the 4th century to the beginning of the 5th. And he was someone who rose quite quickly in the church once he became a Christian. His most famous book is called The Confessions. It's one I'm sure you've heard of. And it's extraordinary that such an ancient work of Christian theology is still a book that you can buy in almost any bookshop today. Most people know St. Augustine as being someone who was obsessed with sex or obsessed with the idea of predestination. Two things have kind of defined what most people think about him. But he's a much, much deeper theologian than that. I spent a lot of time studying how he is perhaps the first person to really articulate what memory is and the role that memory has in our daily lives and in seeking and finding God. But the Confessions are really not a great work of theology in some ways. They are in lots of ways an autobiography, the story of how Augustine found Christianity. As a young man, he was very much part of a sect called the Manichaeans. He was then very influenced by Neoplatonic philosophical thought. And it wasn't until he was a bit older that he really understood what Christianity was all about and became a Christian. We live in a world where we are constantly bombarded with things that will make us a better person, whether that's a diet or a particular way of dressing, whether it's signing up to be a member of a particular organisation or helping or volunteering in a particular way. It was something that was familiar to Augustine, this sense of having an ache or an itch, having something that means we're not quite complete, and constantly trying to find out what it is to fill the gap. And as Christians, there's a danger that we can say, well, that gap is filled by God. God fills everything that is difficult or uneasy in our lives, and God fills the gap and makes us whole. And in a sense, that's true. But Augustine speaks a lot about how it is not about possessing God in that way that is how we find him. God is not an object that we can make our own to keep. He's not something that will fill the gap and make everything rosy. Because we live in a broken world and we are human beings, that gap is always there. Instead, God is something and someone who always leads us on, who encourages us to embrace those gaps, those things that we're uncomfortable with, and in those find out where God opens new horizons to new worlds and new ways of thinking. It's almost like God, described in this book, it's almost like God is leading us on. We are running, and we see him running round a corner, and we keep following, only to find he's disappeared round the next. Augustine's Confessions are a wonderful book. If you ever have time to read them, they're hard work, but they are really incredibly interesting. Augustine is somebody who has inspired so much of Christian thought throughout the last 1500 years. But perhaps most importantly, is his understanding that as Christians, the perfect and only true person is Jesus Christ. We are the ones living in a broken world. We are the ones that will always have a gap until we find God. But when we find him, we don't possess him. We keep on looking forward to see where he leads us, hoping that eventually he leads us to the kingdom.